She was humiliated the moment she stepped into the living room just for her beige linen dress, tied-back hair, and worn fabric tote. Here to grieve or grab your share. Her sister-in-law sneered while the younger one whispered, "Bet her inheritance is just the wedding dress." Her mother-in-law turned away in silence. Other relatives muttered, "She might know how to keep house, but money. Not a chance." Grace simply bowed her head and sat quietly at the end of the table, surrounded by people eagerly waiting to see how much she'd be given. No one knew. In just a few minutes she would become heir to everything. The room was huge, all dark wood and heavy curtains, the kind of place that made you feel small if you weren't born into money. Grace didn't look small, though. She sat straight, her hands folded on the table, her tote tucked under her chair. Her sister-in-law, Ellen, was still smirking, her red lipstick sharp against her pale skin. Ellen was in her late 40s, always draped in designer clothes, the kind of woman who checked her reflection in every spoon. She leaned toward her husband, a balding man in a too-tight suit, and whispered something that made him chuckle. Claire, the younger sister-in-law, flicked her blonde hair and scrolled through her phone, her manicured nails clicking. She was barely out of college, but her voice carried like she owned the place. Margaret, Grace's mother-in-law, sat at the head of the table, her silver hair pinned tight, her black dress crisp. She hadn't said a word to Grace since the news of David's stroke broke. Not one. Grace just kept her eyes on the table, her face calm like she was waiting for a bus, not a will reading. The whispers didn't stop. A cousin Tom lounged in his chair, his Rolex glinting as he gestured. Tom was the kind of guy who bragged about his yacht but never invited you on it. Other than being quiet and frugal, what did she ever bring to the table? He said loud enough for Grace to hear. A woman in a fur shawl, some business partner's wife named Vivian, giggled behind her hand. Vivian was all fake smiles and too much perfume, the kind of person who'd compliment your shoes while checking the label. She leaned toward Tom and added, "Everyone knows Grace was just the housekeeper. No way she can handle even a fraction of the estate." Grace's fingers twitched just once on the table. She didn't look up, but her shoulders squared like she was bracing for a storm. The room kept buzzing, people tossing out jabs like they were at a comedy roast. "Bet she's only getting a tiny apartment if that," Claire said, not even bothering to lower her voice. Ellen laughed, a sharp barking sound. Grace stayed still, her breathing steady, her eyes fixed on a knot in the wood. The lawyer was late. The clock on the mantel ticked loud, cutting through the chatter. People started getting restless, shifting in their seats, checking their phones. A man in a pinstripe suit, Henry David's close friend from the golf club, leaned back, his voice oily. She might have been good at folding sheets, but money, that's a different game. Henry was the kind of guy who'd sell you a car with no engine and call it a deal. He smirked at Grace, waiting for a reaction. She didn't give him one. Instead, she reached down, adjusted her tote, and sat back up, her movements slow and deliberate. The room didn't notice, but it was like she was drawing a line in the sand. Nobody saw it. Not yet. Ellen caught Grace's eye and snorted. "What's in that bag, Grace?" "Coupons." Claire burst out laughing, and Tom clapped like it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. Margaret's lips tightened, but she still didn't look at Grace. The air was thick now, heavy with cruelty, like a room full of kids picking on the quiet girl at school. A new voice cut through, sharp and nasal, belonging to Patricia, a second cousin who always wore too much blush and talked about her charity galas. She stood up, her pearl necklace swinging, and pointed at Grace's dress. "Look at that outfit. Did you borrow it from the laundry basket?" The room erupted in laughter, heads turning to see Grace's reaction. Patricia didn't stop. She walked closer, her heels clicking, and bent down like she was inspecting a stain. "I mean, really, Grace, if you're here for money, at least dress like you belong." People hooted, some clapping. Grace's hand paused on her tote, her knuckles whitening, but her face stayed calm. She looked at Patricia, her eyes steady. "Do you always judge what you don't understand?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. The laughter died down, Patricia's face flushing as she stammered and sat back down. But the damage was done. The room felt colder, the mockery sharper like a blade twisting deeper. Then came Richard, a distant uncle with a booming voice and a habit of talking over everyone. He was in his 60s, his suit straining at the buttons, his face red from too much whiskey. He stood glass in hand and gestured at Grace like she was an exhibit. "This girl," he said, slurring slightly, "thinks she can waltz in here and take what's ours. I bet she's got a list of demands in that ugly bag." He laughed, spilling his drink, and others joined in, their voices overlapping. "Show us the list, Grace," someone shouted. Richard kept going, his voice louder. You were nothing before David. Nothing. Grace's lips pressed tight, her fingers curling around her chair's edge. She didn't speak, but her gaze locked on Richard unblinking until he looked away, muttering. The room didn't notice her strength. They just saw a target and they kept firing. The cruelty took a new turn when Sophie, a family friend who ran a lifestyle blog, pulled out her phone and started filming. Sophie was all about her brand, always in bright dresses and fake lashes chasing clout. Guys, check this out, she said, zooming in on Grace. The housekeeper who thinks she's getting a fortune. #EpicFail. The room roared, people posing for the camera, some waving. Sophie narrated, her voice mocking. Look at that dress. Did you make it from a tablecloth, Grace? Grace's shoulders tensed, her hand brushing her dress as if to smooth it. She looked at Sophie, her voice barely above a whisper. Is your life so small you need to film mine? Sophie's smile froze, her phone lowering slightly, but the room didn't care. They kept laughing, the video already spreading online, each like and share another jab. It got worse when Mark, Ellen's teenage son, joined in. Mark was spoiled, always in sneakers that cost more than a car payment, his hair gelled to perfection. He slouched in his chair, smirking, and tossed a crumpled napkin at Grace. It landed on her lap, and the room went wild, cheering like it was a game. Hey, Grace, clean that up. Mark said, his voice dripping with arrogance. He tossed another, then a pen, each item drawing louder laughs. Grace picked up the napkin, folding it neatly, her hands steady. She looked at Mark, her eyes calm but piercing. Throwing trash says more about you than me, she said, her words soft but heavy. Mark's smirk faded, his face reddening as he slouched lower. But the room didn't stop. The laughter grew, the insults sharper, each one piling on like stones. The final blow came from Diane, a corporate lawyer who'd worked with David's company. Diane was all sharp edges, her black blazer pristine, her voice like ice. She stood holding a folder and addressed the room like she was in court. Let's be real, she set, her eyes on Grace. This woman has no education, no skills, no place here. She's a leech who got lucky. Diane opened the folder, pulling out a photo of Grace from years ago, working at a diner. This is who she is, Diane said, holding it up. A waitress. Not a Parker. The room gasped, then laughed. The photo passed around like evidence. Grace's hand shook as she reached for her tote, but she stopped, her face still. Luck didn't bring me here, she said, her voice clear. Love did. Diane scoffed, but the room's laughter drowned out Grace's words, the photo now a weapon in their hands. Grace's hand rested on the table, her plain silver wedding band catching the light. She didn't fidget or shift like the others. But her jaw tightened when a woman across the table, Lydia, a distant aunt with a face full of Botox, leaned forward. Lydia was all about status, always name-dropping some senator she'd met once. I mean, really, Lydia said, her voice dripping with pity. David was sweet to marry her, but let's be honest. She's out of her depth. Grace's eyes flicked up just for a second and met Lydia's. Am I? She said, her voice soft but clear. The room froze. Lydia's mouth opened, then closed like a fish. Nobody expected Grace to speak. Not like that. Not with that kind of weight. Ellen rolled her eyes, but her smirk faltered. Claire stopped scrolling. Grace went back to looking at the table like nothing happened. But the air had shifted just a little, like a crack in the ice. The lawyer finally walked in, a short man with glasses and a briefcase that looked older than him. His name was Mr. Ellison, and he had the kind of tired face that said he'd seen too many families fight over money. He didn't bother with small talk. He set his briefcase on the table, pulled out a stack of papers, and started reading. The room went quiet, everybody leaning forward like kids waiting for candy. Mr. Ellison's voice was dry, like he was reading a grocery list. He went through the small stuff first, some jewelry to Margaret, a car to Tom, a summer house to Ellen and her husband. People nodded, some smiling, some looking annoyed. It wasn't more. Grace didn't move. She just listened, her hands still folded. Claire whispered to Vivian, watch. She'll get the guest cottage and think it's a palace. Vivian stifled a laugh. Grace's fingers curled slightly, but her face stayed calm. Mr. Ellison turned a page and his voice slowed. And now the primary estate, he said. Everybody sat up straighter. Mr. Ellison cleared his throat. According to the will, the entire estate, assets, properties, shares, bank accounts is to be inherited by Grace Parker. The room didn't react at first. It was like the words didn't land. Then Ellen shot up her chair, scraping. That's impossible, she yelled. Who even is she to take everything? Her face was red, her hands shaking. Claire's phone slipped from her fingers, clattering on the table. No way, she said over and over like a broken record. Tom's mouth hung open, his Rolex forgotten. Margaret finally turned, her eyes narrow, staring at Grace like she was a stranger. Grace didn't move. She didn't blink. She just sat there, her hands still folded, her tote still under her chair. Mr. Ellison looked uncomfortable but kept going. It's all here, he said, holding up the papers. Signed and notarized. The room erupted. People were shouting, pointing, some crying. She married him for money. Vivian screamed, her fur shawl slipping off her shoulder. Henry slammed his fist on the table. What did you ever do besides make tea and clean the house? He spat. Grace didn't answer. She didn't need to. But her eyes moved slowly, scanning the room, taking in every face. It wasn't anger in her look. It was something else, something that made people squirm. Ellen stormed over, leaning so close her perfume stung the air. Grace, give that back to the family. You're not worthy, she hissed. Grace looked up, her gaze steady. Worthy of what, Ellen? She said, her voice low like a whisper you couldn't ignore. Ellen stepped back, her face pale. The room was still loud, but that moment those 4 words cut through it like a knife. People started swarming Grace now. Some begged, their voices fake sweet. Grace, honey, you don't need all that. Lydia cooed, her Botox smile twitching. Others kept yelling. This is a scam. Tom shouted, waving his arms. Grace didn't respond. She just sat there, her hands folded, her tote untouched. But her presence, it was like a wall nobody could climb. The noise was deafening, everybody talking over each other when the door swung open. The room went silent like someone flipped a switch. David Parker stood there alive in a gray suit, his face calm but his eyes sharp. Gasps ripped through the air. Claire dropped her phone again. Ellen's hand flew to her mouth. Margaret's chair creaked as she gripped the arms. David didn't rush in. He walked slow and steady, his shoes clicking on the hardwood. I'm still very much alive, he said, his voice even like he was stating the weather. And this isn't a will reading, it's a test. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. David stopped beside Grace, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. She didn't look up, but her hand reached up just for a second and touched his. It was small, but it said everything. The room was a graveyard of pale faces and wide eyes. Henry tried to laugh, but it came out like a choke. Vivian pulled her shawl tight like it could hide her. David looked around, his gaze steady, taking in every person. I needed to see who truly cared, he said, and who only saw Grace as the gatekeeper to my fortune. Today's reactions made everything crystal clear. His voice didn't waver, but there was an edge to it, like a blade under silk. He turned to Grace, his face softening. You were the only one who didn't ask about money. You asked one thing, does anyone need lunch? And that's why I'm still alive, because of you. Grace's lips parted just a fraction and she nodded, her eyes bright but dry. David faced the room again. My estate will still belong entirely to Grace. She deserves it more than anyone here. If anyone has a problem with that, please leave this house. Today, the words landed like a gavel. Ellen started to speak, but David raised a hand and she stopped. Tom looked at the floor. Claire's hands shook as she picked up her phone. Margaret's face was stone, but her knuckles were white. The room stayed frozen until Mr. Ellison, the lawyer, stood, his hands trembling as he adjusted his glasses. He pulled a sealed envelope from his briefcase and handed it to Grace, his voice low. This came with the will, he said. David asked me to give it to you in case the test happened. Grace took the envelope, her fingers brushing the wax seal, her name written in David's neat handwriting. She didn't open it, just held it, her eyes tracing the letters. The room watched, some leaning forward, others shifting uncomfortably. Ellen's eyes narrowed, her voice sharp. What's that? Another trick. David's gaze snapped to her, cold and final. It's none of your business, Ellen. Grace tucked the envelope into her tote, her movements calm, but her hand lingered on the bag like it held something sacred. The room felt smaller now, the air heavy with the weight of what was unfolding. A quiet cough broke the silence, coming from Sarah, the cousin who'd stayed out of the fray. She stood, her plain sweater and glasses making her look like she didn't belong in this room of wealth. She walked to Grace, holding a small, worn notebook. I found this in David's study, she said, her voice soft. It's his handwriting, about you. Grace took the notebook, her fingers brushing the cracked leather cover. She opened it and a photo slipped out, her and David years ago planting a garden dirt on their hands, smiling. Sarah's voice shook. He wrote about how you saved him grace. Not the money you... The room was silent, some faces softening, others hardening. Grace's hand paused on the photo, her breath catching, but she didn't speak. Sarah stepped back, her eyes wet, and the truth started to settle like dust after a storm. The tension broke when a phone rang loud and jarring. It was Tom's, and he fumbled to silence it, his face red. The screen lit up with a news alert, and he froze his eyes wide. It's out, he stammered, holding up the phone. The headline read, Parker family exposed greed and cruelty at fake will reading. The article had quotes from the video Sophie had posted, now viral, with comments tearing into Tom, Ellen, and the others. People gasped, some pulling out their phones, scrolling frantically. Claire's face went white as she saw her own name trending, her apology post already backfiring. Grace didn't look at the phones. She just stood, her tote over her shoulder, her face calm. David's hand brushed hers and she nodded like they'd planned this all along. The room was unraveling and Grace was the only one standing tall. David stepped forward, his voice steady but louder now, addressing the room like a judge. He pulled a folder from his jacket filled with emails and texts, messages from Ellen, Tom, and others demanding money, plotting to undermine Grace. I've had these for months, he said, tossing the folder on the table. Pages spilled out, some fluttering to the floor. Ellen's face crumpled as her own words stared back at her. Grace is nothing. We'll take it all. Tom's hands shook as he saw his text. She's just a maid. Easy to push out. David's eyes were steel. You thought you could break her. You broke yourselves. Grace didn't look at the papers. She adjusted her tote, her movement slow like she was above it all. The room was a mess of whispers and panic, but Grace's silence was louder. The final moment came when Grace spoke, her voice soft but cutting through the chaos. She stepped forward, holding the notebook Sarah had given her, and looked at the room. I didn't come here for money, she said. I came for David. For love. For family. She paused, her eyes sweeping over Ellen, Tom, Claire, and the others. You showed me what family isn't. The room was silent, every word landing like a stone. She turned to David, her hand brushing his arm, and he nodded, his face proud. Grace walked to the door, her tote swinging lightly, her steps steady. The room watched, some in awe, some in shame. David followed, his hand on her back, and the door closed behind them. The mansion felt empty, the truth echoing in the silence they left behind. People started scrambling. Ellen's husband grabbed her arm, muttering something about lawyers. This isn't over, Ellen snapped, but her voice was shaky. David didn't respond. He just pointed to the door. Vivian tried to sidle up to Grace, her voice syrupy. Grace, I didn't mean. Grace cut her off with a look, not angry, just done. Vivian backed away, her heels clicking fast as she left. Henry stood, his face red, and stormed out, muttering about lawsuits. Lydia tried to smile, but it crumbled, and she slipped out without a word. Margaret stood slowly, her eyes locked on David. You've made your point, she said, her voice cold. David didn't blink. Goodbye, Mother, he said. She walked out, her head high, but her steps were heavy. Grace watched them go, her face unreadable, her hands still folded. The room was emptying, and the silence was loud. Grace stood smoothing her dress and picked up her tote. She didn't rush. Every movement was steady, like she was closing a book. David stayed by her side, not hovering, just there. Mr. Ellison was packing his briefcase, his hands shaking a little. I'll have the papers sent over, he said, his voice quiet. Grace nodded. Thank you, she said, and it was the first time she'd spoken in minutes. Her voice was soft, but it carried. The few people left, some distant cousins who hadn't said much, looked at her differently now. One of them, a quiet woman named Sarah, touched Grace's arm as she passed. You didn't deserve that, Sarah said, her voice low. Grace smiled just a little. Nobody does, she said. Sarah nodded and left, her head down. The room was almost empty now, just Grace, David, and the weight of what had happened. Outside the driveway was chaos. Cars peeled out, tires crunching on gravel. Ellen's voice carried from the porch, yelling about fairness to anyone who'd listen. Nobody did. Grace stood by the window, watching her tote over her shoulder. David came up behind her, his hand brushing her arm. You okay? He asked, his voice gentle. She nodded, but her fingers tightened on the tote's strap. I didn't want it to be like this, she said, so quiet it was almost a whisper. David didn't answer right away. He just stood there, letting her words settle. They showed themselves, he said finally. Grace turned her eyes, searching his face. She didn't say anything, but her hand reached out and he took it. They stood like that for a minute, the mansion quiet around them, the world outside falling apart. The next day, the fallout started. Tom's yacht deal fell through. His investors pulled out after a video of him yelling at Grace hit the internet. Nobody knew who leaked it, but it spread fast. Ellen's boutique lost its biggest sponsor, a fashion brand that didn't want her name tied to the headlines. Gold Digger Gate, the tabloids called it. Claire's influencer account tanked, her followers dropping by the thousands after she posted a tone-deaf apology. Vivian's husband, a hedge fund guy, got a call from his board. Her outburst cost him a promotion. Henry's golf club politely asked him to step back from the board. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was just consequences rolling in like waves. Grace didn't comment on any of it. She didn't need to. Her silence said enough. Grace didn't keep the mansion. A week later, she opened the living room, the same one where they'd torn her apart, as a community space. Food drives, job fairs, free classes for kids. She funded it all, but she didn't show up for the photo ops. Reporters tried to get her to talk, but she'd just smile and say, "The work's what matters." Headlines started popping up. Humble and true, the woman who made a fortune kneel. People shared her story online, not the glitzy version, but the real one. The woman who'd been called a housekeeper, a gold digger, a nobody. The woman who'd stood her ground, not with a scream, but with a look. David was there, always not in the spotlight, but by her side. They didn't talk about the money. They talked about lunch, about the garden, about the kids who'd shown up to learn math. One afternoon, Grace was sorting donations in the living room, her beige dress swapped for a plain sweater and jeans. A photo slipped out of a box, an old one, her and David at a diner laughing over coffee. She paused, her fingers brushing the edges. David walked in, saw her, and stopped. "That was a good day," he said, his voice soft. Grace nodded, her eyes still on the photo. "We didn't have much then," she said. David smiled. "Didn't need it." She set the photo down, her movements careful, and went back to sorting. But her shoulders were lighter, like she'd let something go. The room was full of boxes, people coming and going, kids laughing outside. It wasn't a mansion anymore. It was something else. The story spread not because Grace wanted it to, but because people needed it. Older folks, the ones who'd been judged their whole lives, saw her and felt seen. The ones who'd been called too quiet, too plain, too small, they got it. They'd been in rooms like that, surrounded by sneers. They'd held their ground too. Grace didn't know how many shared her story, how many felt less alone. She was too busy working. But the truth was out there, quiet but heavy like her. It wasn't about the money. It was about standing up even when nobody thought you could. It was about being enough just as you are. Some days Grace would pause, look out at the people in that living room, and let out a small breath. She'd done what she always did, kept going. The world had tried to break her, but it didn't. She wasn't wrong to stay quiet. She wasn't alone in her fight. And now she was building something new. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.